All right, so we'll get things started. Don't want to take up all of Emily's time. I'm really grateful that she's taken the time to come and talk to us via the power of Zoom. And me and Matt were discussing earlier today that we're going to try and figure out a way to get you on campus here in the near future. For some reason, we'll come up with something.
I'm in.
But I don't think I can do justice to introducing you. So I'm going to leave that up to you, and then you can just kind of segue straight into the talk, which sounds incredible just from the title alone.
Okay, great.
Yours.
Nice. Hi, everybody. I can see like the back of some of your heads. Can you guys like turn over your back left shoulder as if you have many shoulders? Hi. Oh, nice. Hi. Nice to see you. Okay, it's very nice to be here. I'm an assistant professor in landscape at UVA. I just came down to the South, a year and a half ago. I was teaching at the GSD for about 5 years before that. And before that, I was a student at the GSD. I studied, I did a dual degree, like a concurrent dual degree in architecture and in landscape. And I did them at the same time, kind of going back and forth. And I think that really set up a lot of this work on pedagogy. So pedagogy, meaning like the practice art of teaching, and I would say learning as part of that. And so I became very aware of these kind of different disciplinary kind of tracks and values, as well as how those manifested in the pedagogy. Got it. So that's where I'm coming to you from. So now I teach exclusively in landscape, but I've also taught in architecture, and so that kind of like feeds the bigger picture here. And I have some very nice UVA. Some of my UVA students are here on Zoom. Hi, Joyce. Hi, Sachi. Okay, so I'd like to share with you today the outline of a kind of pedagogy or pedagogical framework that I'm in the process of developing. It seems to be taking a long time, that seeks to apply landscape architecture research and design methods to the discipline's own pedagogical practices, so to how we teach, right? So questioning what it might mean for the practice of teaching and learning to more fully embody our core disciplinary concepts and values. So in hopes of developing a signature pedagogy specifically for landscape architecture. If you have no idea what a signature pedagogy is, I didn't about 6 months ago either. And I will talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so in particular, I'm interested in applying this approach to the question of advancing inclusivity in design education. So as design education slowly diversifies, it continues to bias in deeply implicit ways, as it largely fails to incorporate the abundant research on inclusive teaching and learning into its kind of core foundations. But without a real structural change, we risk promoting diversity without inclusion, which can reproduce and legitimate new forms of marginalization as we bring in a more diverse set of designers into the same kind of unchanged system, right? And I believe that to really empower a more diverse cadre of new designers requires a more deeper restructuring. So my thinking is that we haven't really pulled in or adopted methods and techniques directly from other fields, so educational theory and research, for example. And so instead, we might actually draw from the disciplines themselves, the design disciplines, and leverage the discipline's core concepts and methods to construct a deeper inclusivity that we might actually learn from what we teach, right, for how to teach, in order to construct an inclusive, though specifically designed pedagogy, right? But I also think that through this deeper connection, we open a productive dialogue between our discipline and our pedagogy that can try to expand and enrich both of those. That we might also increase the likelihood of sticking in a way, right? By this form of inclusivity being really of the design disciplines themselves, right? So towards this end goal of inclusivity, I propose that we look to the spatial design field's engagement with the concept of sight and sightedness as a rich kind of epistemological lens, like a way of thinking, and a conceptual tool to construct a specifically designed inclusivity. So this begins with the basic premise that sight has long had real generative agency in the spatial design fields, but in particular in landscape architecture. As you all know, sightedness is a really foundational and discipline-defining concept in landscape, right? Landscape really builds from nuanced sight readings, critical mapping practices that expand into active sight definition and problem definition that really comes from reading the site, often framing the site as itself the program, right? Landscape then embraces the ongoing processes on a site as the tools of design, the medium of design, right? All alongside a kind of grounding in the phenomenological experience of the site, right? Returning sight to and through the body, right? And I think that this is, sightedness is really something that I think separates, and it's not to say that, I don't know who's in the crowd, not to say that architecture is not sighted, because it absolutely is, right? But I think the sight as in some ways the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle with landscape, I think is something that makes landscape unique. So this framework that I'm hoping to lay out also looks at what it means to be sighted in other fields as well. So like a kind of easy jump from landscape is site-specific art, right? So it reiterates this embodiment of sight. So it often requires one to be on site for the completion of the work, right? If you're not there, you can't experience, you can't understand the work, right? It rejects this kind of distance of the disembodied eye, right? The work serves to replace a tabula rasa, right? A clean slate, a blank slate, with instead a real place, which is within a physical, a cultural, political, and institutional context. It insists upon the social matrix of class, of race, of gender, of sexuality, of the viewer as part of the work, right? So it introduces a kind of pair of specificity, so the site and the viewing subject, right? It's specific to both of those, right? So this draws on postmodern feminist and decolonizing theories of positionality, which emphasize the specificity of the viewing subject, right? So for example, Donna Haraway, her opposition to the neutral, right? I'm putting that in air quotes, the neutral white male gaze that has been naturalized as universal, unmarked, unlocatable, right? And she says the antidote is not to deny difference, or to not to deny that view, right? But to insist upon the specificity and the subjectivity of all people with the situated knowledge, right? So situated and sight, right? Coming from that same source, situ, right? We think of in situ, right? So the situated knowledge that recognizes both individual positionality as well as the multiplicity, the multiples of subjects and position, right? That we each come from a specific place, right? In terms of, location as well as identity, which shapes what and how we know, right? So again, a type of site specificity, but that's within each person. So Jane Rendell of UCL, her site writing brings these concepts closer to design critique. So she applies sightedness to the practice of art criticism. So this situated criticism is attentive to the multiplicity of voices and variations of standpoint, and seeks to replace an expert critic's objective authority with an actual writing, an active writing that constructs as well as traces the sites between critic and writer, artist and artwork, viewer, and reader. So criticism also becoming very situated, site-specific to the work, but also to the critic, right? Understanding that we also have a perspective when we're critiquing work. So this expansion of what it means to be cited is also carried through to education. I think this part's really an important piece of this kind of puzzle. So in critical pedagogical theory, Paulo Freire rejects what he calls the banking model of education, in which students are treated as empty vessels, right? Or tabula rasa or tabulae rasa, multiple, the plural, to be just filled, with knowledge by the instructor. You're all just empty brains, right? To be filled with our knowledge, right? This kind of transmission model, right? He obviously rejects this notion, right? And Bell Hooks kind of shares this critique and advocates for a much more cited approach to students, right? She really feels it's essential to be mutually aware of and fully embrace each student's and instructor's unique voice, their identity and positionality into a co-construction of their education, right? And the classroom space itself, right? So they see this more inclusive approach as essential to embracing and enabling real diversity in the classroom, in an educational system, right? So this aligns with constructivist learning theories that claim that we as learners, we construct knowledge rather than just passively take in information, right? And accumulate it like this banking model, where then we can just use it like money taken from the bank whenever it applies, right? But instead we build upon and within our existing knowledge, right? New information is being filtered through our experiences. And we build our own kind of representations of this knowledge. And we incorporate new information again into this pre-existing knowledge, right? So again, we're not this kind of blank slate, this tabula rasa, but instead we have all these existing site conditions, maybe, right? That we're actually building these ideas into, right? So this pedagogical citedness, I think, returns us, or at least for me, to landscape approaches to site, right? So as landscape educators, we teach our students, or we attempt to teach our students, we learn with our students to embrace sites, right? As rich palimpsests, whose layered histories, whose unique characteristics really drive the design process. We ask students to engage multiple ways of knowing site, grounding rigorous spatial analysis in firsthand phenomenological experience. We encourage an empathy for site that respects identity and values difference between sites, right? Embracing each site's specificity as actually generative of design, right? So the nuance and care with which the discipline, I think, engages sites, right, should then lead us to ask, what if we drew a parallel between student and site? What if we approached our students in the way that we approach our sites? Asking again, what if we applied what we teach, right, to how we teach? And I think there's an interesting setup here of the constructivisms, right? I slipped in the existing site conditions, right? But constructivism's approach to students as themselves, right, unique with rich existing conditions and knowledges to be built within, right, I think would be a similar relationship to landscape to site, right? So constructivism is to site as landscape. Constructivism is to student as landscape is to site, right? So this frames what I'm calling a student and a site pedagogy for design education that approaches students in the way that design, and in particular landscape, approaches sites, with attention to situation, position, and identity, and as generative of their own specific potentialities to be embraced in the co-construction of their own design education. So this framework seeks to develop a series of parallel site and student practices related generally to 3 stages of site engagement. So site condition, site position, and site process. So I'll initially very loosely sketch these out based on some kind of initial tests with these ideas in the landscape representation sequence that I used to teach at the Harvard GSD. So to begin with site condition, we know that sited design employs a detailed reading of existing site conditions to generate design, right? So a student as site approach similarly demands a deep exploration and acknowledgement of each student's unique history to uncover the essential sustaining material to be built off of and designed with in their design education. So this approach requires developing parallel mapping practices for students, actively revealing them as thickened grounds of potentiality to be engaged in their education. So the landscape representation sequence, right, tested this idea in a very small way, began with an exercise titled Personal Representation History, in which students shared some form of pre-design school representation, stating that the first line was, "No student, thankfully, enters the GSD as a clean slate." It tries to demonstrate that every student, with or without a design background, has a long history of translating, making, or organizing their environment. These unique histories constitute the site upon which their design or their landscape education will intervene. Right? And so I found in these kind of tests that by accessing these existing skills, these passions, these ways of being, we could connect more strongly students' new endeavors in landscape to their previous experiences, their interests, their intuitions. The exercise also uncovered students' varied positionalities. It started to situate them as co-learning peers, valued for their diversity of experience, and not as competitors pursuing one right way of being or designing. Which brings us to the second aspect of the framework, site position. So landscape architecture often reframes existing conditions to define their own sites of intervention. So this requires careful attention to a site's specificity and its relationship to other sites and systems, right? And I argue that similarly, the student as site approach understands students' identity and experience as inextricable from the social, cultural, and political power structures, including within the classroom itself, in which students are constantly operating within in relation to one another, the instructor, and the larger institution. So these dynamics between different kind of educational agents, right, become emergent field conditions that require thoughtful design to really shape the classroom to be a supportive space to empower all students to participate and engage with the material. So this requires the use of explicitly inclusive teaching and learning tactics. But we have to actively acknowledge every student's voice and presence and enable them to inhabit, right, their own situated perspectives, as well as us doing that, right, as instructors. So bringing also our own narratives and experiences into the classroom. So trying to set the stage from the beginning of mutual respect, of empathy, to be able to facilitate kind of peer critique and peer learning, which brings us to the last part, which is site process. So working with living systems, landscape architecture is always designing through a site's kind of temporal processes. And a student as site approach then enables the often nonlinear process of learning, right, as or embraces the often nonlinear process of learning as an active design, in which critical reflection can empower students to shape their own learning. So the landscape representation sequence concluded with a fully open-ended final exercise titled Collective Non-Site that built upon that supportive foundation that was laid in site position. Students self-organized a full class collaborative reflection on their first year of graduate school in the form of a collective piece that traced their shared learning process. There were highly creative results over the years, from a physical piece accompanied by a manifesto statement, fashion shows of various forms, to a choreographed and simultaneously archived interpretive performance that translated the design iteration and critique practice. Also with a choir singing durs, you can see on the bottom right. And in each case, the kind of conscious engagement with the process of learning, right, was kind of enabling students to act as more full participants in shaping their own education moving forward. So again, that was a kind of way of framing some of the teaching that I was already doing. But this past semester at UVA, I tried to extend those kind of smaller class tests into Studio, right? So that was a representation course. So I was coordinating the second semester Studio, which I cited in Richmond, Virginia, which you all surely know. It was called Fall Line Futures. And the course was structured around a series of acts, 4 acts. So in the first act, a part, not a part, the goal was to lay the inclusive kind of groundwork for the semester by embracing landscape's foundational value in the interconnectedness and interactions of elements and entities, and not their separateness, right? So in this act, we explored the ways in which parts of places are a part of, not apart from one another. And we did that in 3 quick exercises on 3 different kind of subjects and scales. So the first was our embodiment as a part of, not apart from, the space that we share with others. And the second, which is basically the student as site exercise, was our unique histories, identities, and situated knowledges as a part of, not apart from, our design education. And the third was ecology as a part of and not apart from the social structure of the city, right? So in that, we were doing socioecological mapping of Richmond. So in this act, students made 2 parallel mappings. So one of themselves, so that was the student as site exercise, and the other of Richmond. And so the exercise was kind of 2 parts. So the one was the actual mapping itself. So they were shown a range of kind of abstract maps as inspiration and asked to map themselves as a site. So their existing kind of knowledge, their existing ways of working, ways of designing, values, what has shaped them, et cetera. And we guided them initially, we kind of scaffolded the exercise through a series of questions about where and how they learn, how they best work, what they really care about, et cetera. And the second part of the exercise, so there was the actual physical map itself, right? And the second part was an audio reflection that they recorded on the process of making the map and discussing the map with their instructor and then sort of reflecting on it. Then around mid-semester, we asked students to return to their maps and for them to sort of highlight what threads they were pulling on so far in their studio learning, right? So what parts of their existing knowledges and their existing ways of working they were pulling on, how they were shaping those moving forward, and where they wanted to go for the remainder of the semester. And the last part of the exercise was at the end of the semester. So it was following their final review. They stepped back, took one last take, reflecting upon what and how they had learned that semester. So how they had built that learning also within their existing knowledge, right? And how they wanted to shape their learning moving forward. So in addition, my co-instructor and I, so this was part of a kind of study. We got IRB approval to do this study. That's why you won't see any names in the student work that I show, because we promised them anonymity through the study. So as part of the study, my co-instructor and I each did an audio reflection, reflecting on how this process was shaping our teaching and our teaching practices. So I'm still in the process of kind of analyzing this data, but I can show you a bit of at least the visual part, the student maps. But there was a lot in the audio recordings that won't really come across in these. So to start, we were asking these questions that students were starting to work through in class itself. What kills your mojo? How do you work? What are these the truly inspirational people and places in your life, right? What has shaped your learning? And as well as questions about design process. And each student kind of manifested that into a map in very different ways, right? Here we're seeing different bodies of water that have this one student always kind of needed to be near. different readings or learnings that were like truly transformational, various different kind of layers, right? So we also start to see a conception of sight that comes through in this, and how to map. About midway through the semester, she started to thread between these different layers, which parts of the map she was really, and which parts of herself she was really kind of accessing through the process, through her design process so far in studio. Another student really mapped or represented the site as this really kind of dense web, right? Of many influential kind of values that she had, identities that she had, as well as experiences and interests over time. And this, I mean, just alone, this facilitated really, it was super informative to me as an instructor then of what she really cared about, who she really cared about, right? And how she actually works through her design process, right? And then midway through the semester, she started to pull out that in her project, right? And this is something I'll get to a little bit later. There's a kind of value alignment, I think, that then happened with students and their projects, where the projects really started to embody a lot of the values they came into the program with. She started to note all of the things that she was pulling at, the kind of threads, and then the ways of working that she still wanted to advance and push. Another student, I developed, unfortunately, I don't have a photo of this, but these like 3 nested boxes. And when you took off the top, they all kind of fell apart or fell down and flattened out. And the one was kind of where she had lived and her influences based in place, right? So that was something that came through a lot for our students, was how much the places they had lived really did form who they were, right? So again, actually re-emphasizing the value of landscape, right? And why they were in landscape. And a lot of this, started to relate a lot to the protests in Hong Kong that she was very much a part of, for example, right? Her experiences in Japan, et cetera, and then what it was to move to the US for her, right? So this is like very important, her own kind of migration and what she had learned in that route. And then the second layer was specifically her design process, right? So here we have kind of the starting in the top left corner of the middle piece, right? And moving through, in each of these little kind of tags are different kind of states of mind, different things also that she could do to move her to the next kind of stage in the design process, right? Things that she would do when she got stuck, et cetera, in the design process, right? And these included, and I think they included for a lot of students, like insecurities in the design process as well, and how those manifest and ways of being able to move through those, which again, incredibly helpful for me as an instructor. Right. And this kind of gave a map to be able to point to at any given point. Like, so, okay, so where are you at right now in your design? Okay, we're in this like total uncertainty, too many ideas. All right, what do we need then to move forward? Right. So I'll get to this in a second, but this is a bit of a metacognitive approach or kind of processing that students were able to do. And I was able to help them facilitate that. Right. And I was able to do myself. And then the third were the people who really drive what she does, right? And that is, it's about the relationships with others, right? And so that's this kind of third part that really shapes her experience and why she designs. And so here we have that kind of midterm, this might have been towards the end, that final reiteration of that map. So reflection on that initial map. And what we found is that by discussing that relationship to the Hong Kong protests, it came through then in a translation to understanding Black Lives Matter protests in Richmond, for example, right? Understanding what a yellow economic zone in Hong Kong, what could that mean in a totally different place, a totally different context, right? So we were able to, again, access that existing knowledge a bit more and it more explicitly. It was actually drawn out, like we had the shared space to really discuss it. And it very much influenced her project and how she designed her project, right? And then here we see in the middle is the kind of mid-semester reflection check-in on that design process. And then on the right is a kind of refined and a sort of remodeled design process, right? So how had the design process actually shifted and changed, right? And so in that middle one, that's that midway through the semester. Emotions are heightened. Like, how is this all feeling? What's going on, right? Where are we at now? Where in this design process have you been? What have you been accessing as tools to get you from one little stepping pad to the next, right? And what can we do now moving forward? And then this last is an edited redesign design process based on the experience, right? This I found to be an incredible map and a really incredible conversation that I won't be able to translate in this talk. But this is a student representing her creative galaxy, right? So these are all part of these are all kind of asteroids within the creative process galaxy. Home base, right? Nebula brain, emotional volcano, falling off the cliff, solitude, where 6 people, forest of knowledge, doing stuff, new galaxy, apocalypse. And then the toolkits are the ways, the things that she can do to get from one of the asteroids to the next one, right? And so this became an incredible map for us to be like, all right, I'm feeling like you're kind of unsettled, right? Where are we at right now? You know? And she could be like, I'm at the falling off the cliff moment, and I just need to move into solitude. And what's going to help me get there is actually doing research and pulling back on my books, or maybe talking about it, right? Or using tools, maybe making a mess. We were able to say like, all right, how about for the next 3 days, you fully make a mess. And then at the end of that, we do the cleanup, right? So those are those top kind of two toolkits, right? So again, it offered a really helpful kind of shared language between us. And about halfway through the semester, when she did this kind of reflection, there was an amazing resonance with her actual project. By this point, she had this moment in looking back at that initial map and saying like, oh, wait, maybe I'm actually designing for this apocalypse future, right? I'm actually going to design the accelerated decay of this parking lot. And I'm going to be using X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to shift my toolkit to the actual tools, right, of deconstruction of the parking lot, for example, right? And so it became, again, just one more lens to really talk productively and generatively about her design project. This was a student with an architecture background. And this, again, like the way that this showed me that students also conceptualized site was super interesting. Like, how do you, if you were to represent yourself as a site, like what would it be? Would it be a geological section map, right? Like what actually would it be, right? And here, these series of platforms, right, with these kind of stairs between, and to understand, these are all of the kind of influential literature, all of the inspiration, et cetera. And in the conversations, we were able I was able to really understand for her, right, what it meant to be from Philly, what it meant to spend a ton of her childhood and college years swimming, competitive swimming, right? And I was able to also relate as a competitive soccer player for a long time, right? And so we were able to also build kind of stronger, I think, just interpersonal connections, right? Which kind of was able to be built upon then, right, in all of our kind of desk crits, et cetera, right? And something that I had asked her in this was that top level of UVA was completely blank right now, right? And so part of her task was over the course of the semester, like how was she going to build that thing out, right? And she had started to, in little ways, kind of by the end, but again, highlighting what she was accessing in her studio project. So this is that kind of mid-semester check-in, right? What the different readings were. She was then able to kind of get back to Japanese forestry and aesthetics, et cetera. These things that by making it visible and legible to herself, she was able to pull back on those threads and access. Here, another student, right? Again, this conception of site was just very, very different for different students. But this spoke a ton. This student was not in my section, but spoke a ton to her instructor about design method and how she actually designs, right? There was various values came through in her verbal description around this piece. The audio recording was fascinating around this piece, right? About the reuse and repositioning of materials, again, came through very directly actually in her studio project, which was super interesting. But watching this design process, and she had a really interesting, her audio recording was just kind of constant as she was making. So we got like a very direct window into her design process and thinking process throughout. Similarly, with another student who, right, the map itself, if you were to read the map directly, you wouldn't quite know, but the audio recordings told a ton about her design process, right? Again, this was like hours of audio recordings, just checking back in, checking back in, checking back in. Now I'm thinking of this, and that relates to, as a child, I used to do this, this, and this. And then actually last semester, I was starting to pull at this, and that was really interesting, right? For now, how I might create these little worlds within this larger kind of force, et cetera, right? So again, just learning a lot about the design process itself, as well as the kind of values, right? So her mid-semester check-in, much more verbal, right, in how she was kind of digesting what was going on. But this was a very important reflection for her, that she kept in her audio recording saying how, wow, actually talking through this, I now have a very new understanding of how I'm learning, right? Like there was this, again, metacognition happening as she worked through it. And by the end, after the final, she kind of distilled down a lot of these ways of working, designing into these sort of key operations that she now wanted to carry forward, right? And there was a lot about, but particularly in this one, right, comfort with iterating, accepting process. There was a ton around, I think, in part, doing the exercise emphasized, again, process, the process now of learning, right? And in the reflections, there was a ton about the process of learning, the process of designing, but also process in landscape, right? So the idea, again, that it resonates with the core disciplinary value or concept. This was a student who chose to represent his life as thus far, three different states of water. And there was actually a fourth, which is coming to UVA and being within this, which we had discussed a lot, was going to be the waterfall falling off the edge of the of the table, right, off the edge of the piece of chip, which was partially just kind of following the process and being completely immersed and engulfed within it. And so within these three different states of water, this very beautiful little kind of bits of handwriting throughout. And this, a lot of these conversations were deeply personal, and again, built this very strong kind of resonance between instructor and student. But it also told me a ton about how this student had evolved over time, why they were here, what they wanted to get out of this, how they wanted to move forward, as well as then the actual making of the piece itself. So he had said he had never really dove so much into just drawing and discovering through drawing as he had in this piece. And that then became, and he talked about how intuitive and how incredible and transformative that process it was of just making this. So then that became a tool that we used throughout his design process. Was like, all right, so what does it mean? We put away the computer. What does it mean to just fully and deeply start to draw in different ways? So again, it told a lot about a potential design process, right? Here, using a kind of tree cookie, right? So, and he talked about embedding, there's an embedding of time within tree rings that he could play off of. I'm going to go a little bit quicker. I know we don't have that much longer. And then again, revisiting, coming back and saying like, all right, how am I working through this, right? How is this pulling at what I'm doing now? And where is the body in this map of self he talks about, right? So there's a lot of kind of deeper reflection going on in this. And then at the very end, trying to kind of make logic out of this whole process of the semester, right? What was that process of working and how did it resonate? What worked for students and what didn't was something super important. This was a fascinating student who saw themselves really as the big hairy tarantula within this really thick web of ideas that have driven them over time. Boredom, loneliness, self-criticism, right? Each one of these had like two different sides as well of two kind of counteracting identities and experiences. And then again, what thoughts and ideas move her between these different spots. And so over on the right, she spent a ton of time on this little origami spider that you actually push on the back and it can hop around throughout. So her reflection halfway through and towards the end was, All right, now so if this is the kind of web of my learning and thinking, what route through this web did I take this semester, right? And then where do I want to go moving from here? So in general, to kind of recap, and again, I haven't done the full analysis on this, the kind of results from that we noticed from the student work was really advanced metacognition. So thinking about thinking, learning about how you learn, right? That was, first of all, just in the very first exercise of doing it, it was there. And then that metacognition advanced throughout the semester. A really increased sense of agency, so student agency, so students being able to and having agency to ask for what they needed also from their instructor. I mean, but giving it this language, that agency was very much advanced, as well as learning agency. So really shaping how they wanted to learn moving forward and making that explicit really in their reflections. A focus again on process, like I had mentioned before, value alignment. So the values that they laid out in their maps really came through in their studio projects. Like there was an incredible alignment between their maps and their studio projects, which I think again is the value of representation. It's why we make things explicit. It's why we make things visual and spatial, right? Is then we can design them, we can understand them, we can engage with them in a different way. They then also had very situated critiques of the studio. So the studio, their feedback became much more like, all right, so there was this little exercise. It didn't resonate for me, but I saw that it resonated for other students. And I coming back then to learning styles. Now my learning style really clicked with this exercise and this exercise, right? So again, that's part of that metacognition. But I think it really helped us in getting also feedback on the course and what works for different learning styles and why. And then that process of making the subconscious conscious, right? So there was a lot of thinking by students about their intuition. They started to understand their intuition in a very different way and to be able to actually make it kind of conscious, right? So make it explicit. And then I think be able to shape it a little bit more and having a little bit more agency over it. And then in terms of instructor results, we were able to adapt just much more, right? Adaptation, a key like landscape principle, right? We were able to adapt in very specific ways to each student. So in some ways, we adapted the exercises somewhat, but in other ways, we mainly adapted the communication around the exercises. So with one student, it might have been like, I know this is going to be an uncomfortable exercise. This is going to involve a lot of ambiguity. And I know that in your student site mapping, you really talked about how you need kind of a lot of clarity. So this is going to be a tough one. This one's going to be a bit of a stretch, right? But I'm here. We're going to work through it together, type of thing, right? So some of it was adapting natural communication around it, and the other was adapting the support. I learned from a number of the Chinese students how difficult being dropped into an American political system and engaging with race and issues that really are very situated in the U.S. in the way that we were talking about them, right? And so my co-instructor and I just had all of the international students. We realized that having a separate space was going to be really valuable for students to be able to ask any question. And we did our very best at giving a kind of breakdown. This was at our house over a nice big dinner of as best we could, the history of kind of race relations in the US and working through like terms, the difference in terms between colored people and people of color, like these things that are just actually incredibly basic, but can be real like catch-ups, right, for people. And so we were able to adapt our support to students to where was needed based on their feedback in the student site mapping. We were able to better help them align their values with their projects. I think it just improved the working relationship, right, between student and instructor. I don't actually use the term instructor in my teaching, I use learning facilitator. So that also signals a kind of constructivist lens on teaching. Again, it gave us a shared language, like you use those terms, right? So now we can kind of point to that map and say like, well, what about here? What about here? What about here? Where are you at now? Yeah, so on and so forth. I'm gonna skip through the rest of this. Something that was a big part of this was that there was a little bit of, right, instead of the instructor kind of talking at, a general student and the students kind of responding generally to the teacher, we were able to come a little bit closer, right? And create a kind of overlapped space. And that was the student site. That was a space in between instructor and student where we could point to things. It was a new space, basically. And that really is kind of how we conceptualized it, and the students also. And something that my co-instructor and I learned in doing this is that we also needed to do this exercise for students. Like, we needed a, learning facilitator, also basically student as site for us as well, so that they knew, right, where that overlap was and where we could really work best together. So in conclusion, these are very preliminary tests and ideas, which I'm hoping to much further articulate over the next couple of years. And to think about what it might mean for these ideas to really restructure pedagogy on a more fundamental level. Again, with the hope that by constructing a specifically design inclusivity out of our discipline's foundational concepts and methods, we enrich both our understanding of the student and in turn challenge and advance that disciplinary concept, in this case of sites, right? Really asking how our pedagogical practices can more fully embody our discipline's methods and research, not just through what is being taught, but also how we teach it, right? And I ask in my research if this might be the foundations of a novel landscape signature pedagogy. So a signature pedagogy is the kind of characteristic form of teaching and learning for specific, like, pre-professional or professional programs, right? So law school kind of has its signature pedagogy, design school has its signature pedagogy. And these are types of learning that, or kind of forms of learning that organize the way that future practitioners, right, you all are educated for your new professions, right? Wherein novices are instructed, often subconsciously, I think, in implicit ways, in three fundamental dimensions of professional work. So how to think, how to perform, and how to act with integrity. So there are really implicit values in our signature pedagogies that are passed on to, in this case, our designers, and ultimately will be embedded in the designs that are made in the world, right? And so in a similar way, to how, in order to kind of understand a culture, we might look to a culture's nurseries, right? Daycare, like nursery systems. To understand a profession and its values, we might look to their signature pedagogies, right? And I would argue that in the spatial design fields, architecture is like this whole separate presentation. Architecture has kind of driven the signature pedagogy that we've largely adopted, architecture's way of teaching in the other spatial design fields. But I would ask what each discipline itself has to offer to start to diversify and make more nuanced a signature pedagogy for the spatial design fields, and in particular, what landscape has to offer. And what would a landscape signature pedagogy look like, right? Is it one that foregrounds inclusion? Is it one that foregrounds inclusion from our disciplinary values, such as site specificity, interconnection, mutualism? Or does it simply follow in the footsteps of architecture? Okay, that's it. Oh my God, that was too long. Sorry, Sean.
Emily, I think we've changed it. So if you have a question, wave to the camera, which rotates so Emily can see who you are. I'm really curious how, like, you're obviously, majority of the folk here are the second and third years, because our busier students are away on a bit of field work. But for our more junior students, I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about how you as a designer operate listening to this? Anything kind of bubbled out? Thoughts?
Well, I had a question just on, like, have there ever been students that are kind of resistant to this, and like, how do you adapt with that?
Yeah. Sorry, there's someone banging at my door. Hold on one second.
Get out of here.
Oh well. Yeah, that's a good question. Few and far between, to be totally honest. There have Yeah, not that much. But I think that requires, when that has happened, it's just another mode of adaptation, I think. And it is like, I think that we have a way of working. And I think in large part, our kind of mode of design education works for some students very well, but not for all students. And so even I think a counter method to that might work for some students and not for all students, but hopefully it starts to even out a little bit more who it actually works for, and who has kind of access in a way to the discipline and is being supported by the pedagogy. So I don't know if that answers your question. Now I can see like I see more of you. Just watching this camera turn.
It's kind of creepy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I think also part of this process is saying like, it allows me actually to question my own biases in which students I resonate most with. Because we do this student site mapping, I can be like, okay, this is now, it's made clear to me, like you think in this very specific way. So now I am going to do my best to adapt to that way, even though it's not intuitively how I work, right? So it actually allows to kind of overcome those differences a little bit easier. But I do think, for some students, even just taking the week out to do the mapping at first, a couple of students in their reflections were a little bit, I think, asking why we were doing it. But then pretty quickly by the end, I think the reflections were kind of thick enough that they kind of understood why they did it for themselves, right? So it kind of advanced again their knowledge of how they think and how they work, in an interesting way. I hope that answered some of that question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. Like, what's the most surprising thing or like outcome of how like landscape students kind of respond to this type of teaching compared to like when you taught architecture students? Kind of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I never really tested this method in with architecture students. But I would say for me, just in my experience in teaching, I loved teaching architecture students through the lens of landscape, like through pushing back, especially on site and site conceptions, and how first day of class, like what is site? And a lot of times I would get an address and the dimensions, right? And I think that was so telling to me of like, all right, let's do some work right in here around this idea, right? Around site. And I think that, I think architecture thinking has a lot to provide also to landscape, but I think landscape has a lot to provide also to architecture. And I think we're always a little bit like the little sibling in the room. As a younger sibling, I resonate with that. The little kind of sibling in the room who doesn't really quite get to share as much, I don't know, with the kind of the much bigger programs. I mean, often we're in programs where architecture is the larger kind of force. But I think there's a lot to learn, especially from the way that we approach site and process and time, especially in a moment of climate change, et cetera. Yeah.
Questions, Matt, Terry, Kathar, I mean, Jen, educator, Jay Young. Any questions from an educator perspective?
Well, I would just make a comment first. I'm on the back side of the camera, Emily, so sorry. I've seen you talk about this before, and I was really excited when Sean got you to be present with us today. We've been having a lot of conversations amongst the faculty about pedagogy and about profession and about sites. And I have an incredible set of notes here. So my third year class, which is sitting in front of the camera, which you could almost see a minute ago, we're gonna do some exercise with this. It's a little bit on the fly, but I want to thank you for really informing how I'm thinking today.
Great. That's great to hear. Good.
I'll go Jan and then follow with me.
Is this research still going on with students?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, sorry, the previous person, I thought you had a follow-up question after that, but I do want to say that I think I don't think that any of these methods are none of these are the final iteration. And so I love that you're going to take some of these and just test in different ways. Because I think more than anything else, I think I just want to foreground that it's a design project in a way. Design pedagogy is a design project, and how we choose to use our methods and our skills at reframing the design project, I think is just generative in and of itself. And student on site might not be the way to do it, but it's asking like, what do we think is the way? Is there a way? This kind of use of an analogy also just might not be the way to do it. But then if not, like, okay, then let's try something else. Like, what are the other things that we can bring to the table with that? So anyway, that was just to the last person. And to the very last person, are these tests? Yes. So this was the first time I had tested just the mapping exercise. It was in the spring, and this upcoming spring, I plan on furthering that, but also having testing very different, basically like metacognition scaffolding exercises throughout the semester. I think that was a big part of this, was learning what we actually got from the exercise, and then now how can we build that into the rest of the course in a much more substantial way. So it's not just these moments that we take aside and we do this little mapping exercise, right? But how actually can it start to restructure parts of the class itself. So that's then hopefully the study that'll continue in the spring. Yeah.
Matt?
Hey, Emily, my name's Matt. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciated it. Personally, very, very interested in what you're doing. And I think we've done a lot of the same things maybe over the year and have a lot of similar interests. So I look forward to talking to you and kind of getting into it. But a few things that I did just want to ask you, I was curious about was, I see the direct relationship, comparison between site and person as an individual, unique, dynamic, discrete, all these things. How do you view them, like when you put it into pedagogic practice, how do you view things like working in teams and groups, for example? Because if you're seeing each person as an individual and recognizing that, then what happens when they get into groups and teams? How does your metaphor work then?
Yeah. It gets a little sloppy at times. I think it's a very good point. And a very good question. So as I've seen it so far, and I haven't done a ton of work at that scale, and that definitely needs to happen. But is thinking about, something I think a lot about is the context of, so the site within context and always interrelating with other kind of forces and sites, basically. Again, it's like the analogy only goes so far, I think, which is a holdup of using an analogy like this. But I do think in terms of group work, period, I think it requires the critical lens on this, the like critical constructivist part of it is like requires that there's always a look at the power structures and hierarchies that are always operating between student to student. And those are, based on identities, based on class, based on like so many other attributes. And so giving actually a lot of time and care into what students need to be able to respectfully share ideas and have. So I think actually a lot of care, but it's true. It does come out of the kind of individual. There's another kind of model that I've been working with a landscape educator, Kate Smaby from Berkeley on, which is mutualism as model. So in trying to shift from, in parallel to our understandings, for example, of like forest ecology, shifting from competition as the primary model, but actually towards an awareness of mutualism as maybe the primary model. And so part of, I think, student as site is almost the first step towards a mutualist model, then in which we understand what each individual can provide and has to provide and how they relate to then be able to exchange resources, exchange knowledge, and work together in kind of novel ways. So, but then that's just layering on one more analogy. And I don't know if that's, maybe too much, but yeah.
Can I ask a second question, if you don't mind? I'm curious. So the data that you collected were was that the drawings and the imagery that you showed in the last half of your presentation?
Yeah, that was some of that.
How did you analyze that data? This is a methodological rather than pedagogical question.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of like metacognition.
Yeah, totally. So we had, so that's a great question. And I feel like I'm learning all of this. This is a separate thing about MLAs being terminal degrees. And then we can go on and teach. And now I'm learning to do the research in a tenure track position. But basically it was an inductive methodology at first. I had a research assistant, and we were both separately going through and analyzing just for like the basics, right? We started to read through for the basics of metacognition. We actually started with the transcripts of the audio recordings because those were just much more explicit. Then the visual analysis came after that. So then in that one, we used more of a deductive process based on what we had developed in the inductive process. But we had begun with just starting to see what things were surfacing, like what major concepts were surfacing in the written data. And again, it was all IRB, it was all like made anonymous, which is a little bit tricky because I obviously know all of the work, or like whose it actually was. But then my other researchers did not, so that was helpful. And then we found different models, or not models, but ways of breaking down metacognition that other scholars had used or had developed. And so one of those, we then chose to do a kind of deductive breakdown of the metacognitive stuff that we were getting out of the audio recording. And then the visual, though, became, I mean, it was much trickier, and I don't think we really could have understood it fully without having done the audio recordings. But that became, somewhat similar to how, and I had talked with a lot of SOTL, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning scholars, about how to do that type of analysis. And they kept emphasizing, use your disciplinary skills of analyzing visual media. But now for this different set of kind of criteria. So it began with an inductive of the written piece, then it shifted to a deductive of the kind of visual pieces, if that makes sense. Matt, is this Towers that I'm talking to?
Yes.
Hi.
He's just off the camera.
Hi. I haven't even there's this whole self-regulated design learning lens on this whole thing. Anyway, I would love to talk to you more.
Sure. No, I loved it. Really, really interesting. And just reading the paragraph that Sean shared with us. And when I saw it this morning, I just very intrigued. I didn't really know what to expect. And I just really wanted to be here today to hear this. And so I'm eager to come up and visit you or have you come here because I don't know. I think there's a lot. Well, I would just say on behalf of students, here and there, it's really refreshing. And I think it's personally really important for faculty members to share themselves with students and who they are, which it sounds like you're doing. But even more important, to get to know each person as an individual and then start to differentiate how you teach based on those individuals. Because while I think it's important to have that signature pedagogy you were talking about, I think it's equal or more important to have an effective teaching and learning method. And I think what you're doing by understanding each person and helping them fine-tune themselves relative to the project is develop an effectiveness that'll really make a difference and how they learn, and ultimately how folks become designers, and then ultimately the world that we create. So I really think you're onto something. For me personally, I just enjoyed it, and I thought you did a great job presenting it. Your first half of your slides, the logic, the way it flowed was excellent. Really good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. That's great to hear. I think in terms of student specificity, I think this is another thing. It's like there are things that we actually do all the time as design educators. Like we do it. We do it, right? We don't teach, like in studio, it is a setup for that, but it's saying like, well, let's make that a little bit more explicit, and let's pull it out, and let's say why we're doing it and how we can do it more, and trying to give it. I think there's also a lot of the way that I was teaching, or the way that I teach, that is, I think easily dismissed as like, oh, like being super sensitive and being overly caring, and I think it's gendered and et cetera, et cetera. And I think part of creating this kind of structure is saying like, there's a reason behind this. Yes, part of these are my intuition as a person relating to other people, but actually when I step back and look at it a little bit thicker, like in a little bit of a deeper way, there's something else behind this, and let's try to make that explicit so it can be understood in a different way. And I think the alignment with actual educational theory and effective teaching, I think, is strong there. And so how to make that clear. And I think to your other point, Matt, around affecting the students and how students are learning. And then I would say also students who then go on to teach, right? I mean, I hope I have a separate and a paper I'd love to send with you at some other time. The students are just like, geez, guys, but is specifically around like disruptions of folk pedagogy. And so in teaching, in trying to disrupt with current students before the system has selected its successors, essentially, right? And so now can we be shifting like who feels empowered to go on to teach, and who actually takes part in that, and in understanding that they might do it in a different way than they were taught. Yeah.
That also sounds very interesting. I would love to read that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I could use that.
Let's give Emily a final round of applause.
Thanks.
Critique to go off to. We're meant to be there as well. So I'll see Emily off and meet you guys down at the.
All right.
All right, very good.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was awesome.